For most of human history, death has been the final wall, a silent edge, a place where questions go and never come back. Every culture has asked the same thing in different ways. Does something of us survive? A soul, a mind, a spark, a continuation. For centuries, science answered with a firm, unromantic word. No. When the brain stops, consciousness ends. Lights out. Game over. But now, in 2026, that certainty is cracking. Not because of belief, not because of religion, but because of data. Because science is finally being forced to admit something deeply uncomfortable. Death may not be the end of consciousness. And the evidence is no longer anecdotal. It's measurable, repeatable, and peer-reviewed. Let's begin with the moment of death itself. For decades, doctors defined death as the moment the heart stops. Then it became brain death, when electrical activity But in recent years, high-resolution EEG monitoring has revealed something strange. In multiple hospitals, across different countries, researchers recorded organized brain activity after clinical death. Not random noise, not residual firing, but structured patterns. The same patterns associated with memory recall, awareness, and internal experience. In some cases, this activity surged after the heart stopped, as if the brain was doing something. One 2024 study observed gamma wave bursts lasting up to 90 seconds post-cardiac arrest. Gamma waves are linked to conscious thought. That alone shook neuroscience. But it didn't stop there. Patients who were resuscitated, people who were, by all medical standards, dead, began reporting experiences that matched those brain patterns with terrifying precision. They didn't describe dreams. They didn't describe confusion. They described clarity. They described awareness without a body. They described observing rooms they couldn't physically see. They described conversations that later turned out to be accurate. And here's the part science can't ignore anymore. In controlled hospital experiments, visual symbols were placed in operating rooms, visible only from the ceiling. Patients who and came back described them correctly. No oxygen, no heartbeat, no measurable brain function at the time, yet perception still occurred. Which raises a question science avoided for over a century. Is consciousness produced by the brain, or merely filtered by it? In 2026, leading neuroscientists are no longer laughing at this idea. They're publishing about it. Some now compare the brain to a radio, damaged radio, distorted signal, destroyed radio, signal gone from the receiver, but not necessarily from existence. And this changes everything, because if consciousness is not fully generated by the brain, then death may not erase it. It may simply disconnect it. This doesn't prove heaven. It doesn't confirm hell. It doesn't validate any one religion. But it does force science to admit something historic. We do not end as cleanly as we thought. And this is only the beginning. In part 2, we, LL, explore near-death experiences that science once dismissed, and why researchers now admit they can no longer explain them away. For decades, science had a convenient explanation for near-death experiences. Hallucinations, oxygen deprivation, dying neurons, misfiring in panic. Case closed. Except the stories never behaved like hallucinations. Hallucinations are chaotic, fragmented, different every time. Near-death experiences were anything but. Across cultures, ages, and belief systems, people describe the same sequence with unsettling consistency. Separation from the body, heightened awareness, a sense of movement, often upward or outward, encounters with presence, not always figures, and an overwhelming feeling of meaning. In 2026, researchers were forced to confront a question they'd long avoided. Why are these experiences structured? In controlled studies, patients who had no prior exposure to near-death literature still reported identical elements, even children too young to understand death. More troubling still, many described events that happened while they were clinically dead. Not metaphors, not impressions. Specific details. A doctor dropping an instrument, a conversation in the hallway, a code blue announcement made after brain activity ceased. And when checked, these details were correct. This shattered the old explanation, because memory formation, according to neuroscience, requires a functioning brain. Yet these memories were vivid, stable, and long-lasting, sometimes clearer than everyday life. Some patients even described awareness that felt more real than being alive. Sharper perception, faster thought, no pain, no fear. This led to an uncomfortable hypothesis gaining traction in 2026. Consciousness may not degrade at death. It may intensify. New imaging studies revealed something unexpected in resuscitated patients. Instead of trauma-related confusion, their brains showed patterns similar to deep meditation and heightened coherence. Not stress, not panic. Focus. And then there's the transformation. People who experience near-death events don't just survive, they change. Radically. They lose fear of death. They report reduced materialism. They become more empathetic, These changes persist for decades. This isn't typical psychological trauma behavior. It is more consistent with people who believe at a cellular level that death is not the end. Science doesn't like transformation as data, but when millions of cases show the same after effects, it becomes impossible to ignore. Even skeptics now admit, near-death experiences are not random brain events. They follow rules. They have structure, and they carry information. In 2025, a landmark review paper concluded something unprecedented. There is no existing neurological model that fully explains near-death experiences without assuming some form of consciousness independent of the brain. That sentence alone marked a turning point. Not proof, but admission. Admission that materialism, the idea that consciousness is only chemistry, is no longer sufficient. Which brings us to the most disturbing implication of all. If consciousness can exist without the body, then death may not be a shutdown. It may be a transition. In part 3, we'll examine what quantum physics, information theory, and modern neuroscience are now suggesting about where consciousness could go, and why it might never be destroyed. If consciousness doesn't die with the body, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where does it go? For most of the 20th century, science dismissed this question as unscientific, too philosophical, too speculative. But in 2026, that line has blurred because modern physics has a problem of its own. At the smallest level of reality, matter doesn't behave like matter. It behaves like information. Quantum physics tells us something radical. Information is never destroyed. Particles can change form. Energy can transform. But information, the fundamental description of a system, persists. This isn't belief. It's a law. So if consciousness is a form of information, then annihilation becomes impossible. Some neuroscientists and physicists now argue that consciousness may be not confined to a single point in space, not locked inside the skull. Experiments in quantum entanglement show particles influencing each other across distance, instantly, without a signal traveling between them. No time, no space. This forced physics to accept something deeply unsettling. Reality is not locally contained, and if reality itself is non-local, consciousness might be too. In 2026, interdisciplinary research teams began modeling the brain not as a generator of consciousness, but as an interface. A biological decoder. The brain tunes consciousness the way a lens focuses light. Damage the lens, the image distorts. Break it completely. The light doesn't vanish. It simply no longer projects into this physical space. This framework explains something science struggled with for decades. Why consciousness disappears under anesthesia, then returns intact. Why people with severe brain loss can still retain personality. Why near-death experiences feel hyperreal. Because consciousness may not be turned off. It may be temporarily blocked. And when the body shuts down entirely, that filter dissolves. Some physicists propose that consciousness exists within the quantum field itself, a vast informational structure underlying the universe. Not heaven, not hell, but a state beyond space, a place where identity is preserved as pattern, not flesh. This aligns with reports from near-death survivors who say they didn't feel like they were going somewhere, but rather remembering, as if awareness expanded instead of traveled. In 2026, a controversial paper suggested that consciousness may survive death, the same way a waveform survives collapse. Not as a body, not as a ghost, but as structured awareness. And here's the chilling part. If consciousness persists, then death doesn't erase identity. It removes limitation. No hunger, no pain, no physical boundaries, just perception, just awareness. This doesn't mean immortality in the human sense. Change still occurs. Evolution still happens, but it may happen outside of time. Science hasn't mapped this realm, but it has stopped denying its possibility. And that shift matters. Because once science admits that consciousness might survive death, the final question becomes the most personal one of all. What happens to you? In part 4, we'll explore what these discoveries mean for identity, memory, and the possibility that death is not an ending, but a continuation we've been misunderstanding all along. If consciousness survives death, then death is no longer a full stop. It's a comma, and that realization changes how we understand ourselves. For centuries, identity was tied to the body. A name, a face, a lifespan. But in 2026, science is beginning to suggest something far more unsettling. You are not the body. You are the pattern moving through it. Memory, emotion, intention, these may not be stored solely in neurons, but encoded in the structure of consciousness itself. This explains a mystery long ignored. Why do some people, after near-death experiences, report memories that don't feel new, but recovered? Why do they say things like, I remembered who I really was? Or it felt like home? These aren't poetic metaphors. They're consistent descriptions. Researchers now speculate that identity may function like a compression file temporarily unpacked into physical form, then reintegrated into a larger field of awareness at death. Not erased, not judged, integrated. And that brings us to the most controversial finding of all. Life reviews. Many near-death survivors describe experiencing their lives not as a timeline, but as a simultaneous awareness, seeing how their actions affected others, feeling emotions they caused, both good and bad. Science once dismissed this as guilt hallucination, but in 2026, neurologists admit there is no known brain process capable of generating multi-perspective, emotional experiences while the brain is offline. If consciousness persists, then experience persists, and responsibility persists, not punishment. Understanding. This reframes morality not as fear-based, but awareness-based. You don't pay for your life. You comprehend it, and comprehension, for many, is more powerful than judgment. So what happens next? Science doesn't claim a destination. No pearly gates. No eternal fire. Instead, it admits uncertainty and possibility that consciousness continues to evolve. Possibility that death is a transition into a broader state of awareness. Possibility that meaning doesn't end with biology. And perhaps the most profound implication of all. If death isn't the end, then life isn't a test. It's a chapter. a learning environment, a temporary focus. In that light, fear loses its grip. Not because answers are complete, but because annihilation is no longer the default assumption. In 2026, science hasn't proven life after death, but for the first time, it has admitted this. It can no longer rule it out. And that admission changes everything. Because once death is no longer certain oblivion, every moment becomes more significant, not less. This isn't about belief. It's about humility. The humility to say, we don't fully understand consciousness. We don't fully understand death. And maybe we never did.